Good evening and welcome to week 8 in the 16-week webinar series that we're producing, uh, Sharia crimes, specifically targeting police officers, social workers, and judicial officials. Tonight, a very challenging subject, the psychological factors leading to Muslim violence and honor killing. As you watch the news and you see the level of brutality that comes with ISIS, or even in America where we've had our own beheading in Oklahoma, you got to wonder what is in the mind of people who can be that savage to other human beings. And we're going to jump right into that topic tonight. Remember, you can continue to ask questions that will be addressed. So we're going to turn it right over to David Boris and look at the psychological factors leading to Muslim violence and honor killing.
Okay, let's start. And our major takeaways for tonight, we'll end up with an understanding of the 5 cultural factors that influence Muslim males to be violent toward Muslim females and to non-Muslims. The second is the link between Muslim domestic violence and jihad, the different beliefs about violence held by the West and fundamentalists, the use of extreme savagery by jihadists, and finally, an introduction to honor violence within Muslim families. Much of the information in tonight's webinar comes from a study entitled Report from the Therapy Room: Why Are Muslims More Violent and Criminal? It was conducted in 2012 in Copenhagen, Denmark, at a juvenile facility where young boys aged 12 to 17 were compared with Muslim boys who were the same age, all serving criminal sentences. The conclusion of the study was that Muslim culture influences Muslims that makes them more prone to criminality, especially toward non-Muslims. The report was authored by Nikolai Sannels, a psychologist who has studied and lectured about Muslim gangs and integration. The inscription in the photograph reads, "We have to find places in our planet where such people can live without the pressure of having to integrate and where their surroundings do not suffer them from their anti-social behavior, religious fanaticism, and lack of contribution to our economy," end quote. Another significant finding was that crime rates in second and third generation immigrants are 70% more criminal than first generation in the same age group, and 5 times more violent than local non-Muslim youths. So the question the study then attempted to answer is why? Why are many Muslims men more criminal and violent than non-Muslim? In 2017, another study was released in Germany. KFN stands for Criminology Research of Lower Saxony. The study looked at 45,000 teenagers in 61 towns and villages across Germany, and found among Muslim boys there is a significant correlation between Islamic religiosity and the use of violence. And reported on May 13th, 2018, the Institute of Social Policy and Understanding reported its latest survey results. A significant number of U.S. Muslims, that's right, U.S. Muslims believe that Muslims are prone to negative behaviors and are more prone to violence. Note that these Muslims are labeled Islamophobes by other Muslims for expressing these beliefs. Any criticism of Islam, remember, must be suppressed even when expressed by Muslims themselves. Who criticized Muslims for speaking out? One is Dalia Mogahed, the current executive director of the Institute for Social Policy, formerly head of Obama's Advisory Council on Faith-Based Partnerships, and a collaborator with the Muslim Brotherhood front groups. She was also a member of the Department of Homeland Security's Counter-Violent Extremism Working Group, the very entity charged with developing federal training following the purge of 2011. Returning to our Copenhagen study, the cultural factors Sennels and his associates looked at were anger and aggression versus self-control, honor versus shame, victim mentality versus personal responsibility, Muslims versus non-Muslims, and then men versus women and the impact on children. The question looked at was how can these factors influence someone to harm another person, just like Dick mentioned earlier. The first factor is anger versus self-control. Our Western mindset is that anger shows weakness, a lack of maturity, and we must always strive to keep our emotions of anger in check. It's always best to strive for and try to achieve win-win through the process of give and take. When I give this training in the classroom to peace officers, I remind them how we were all told to converse on our patrol vehicle radios. No matter how stressful the situation, always speak calmly, distinctly, with no hint of emotion. I'm sure airline pilots are told the same thing. And we've all experienced, or at least heard of, the consequences when people don't keep their cool, like road rage. But Muslim culture is different. Negotiation or give and take is considered a weakness, and avoiding confrontation is cowardice that causes shame. Any deviation from these expected norms leads to personal humiliation by others. Thus, conforming to group expectations of aggression is critical. In addition to a willingness to sacrifice oneself for the group or tribe, anyone who can't be trusted and is shunned. Another aspect of negotiations or give and take is that opponents must be exploited, taken advantage of. Any goodwill gestures, especially when offered by non-Muslims, must be followed by more demands. We saw this being played out during the process of Islamization of our culture by the Muslim Brotherhood, and their demands for more and more special Sharia-compliant privileges for Muslims. Any compassion by an opponent signifies inferiority. Another cultural factor of the study dealt with honor-shame. In the West, most of us try at least to take criticism as a way forward to improve. We know sometimes we must apologize and ask for forgiveness, and being defensive or offering excuses is a form of insecurity and immaturity. For Muslims, however, honor is tied to public opinion, not to inner conscience of guilt. If no one finds out about a personal transgression, there is no harm or no guilt. Most of us can relate to the inner guilt we feel at 2 a.m. when we wake up knowing we've done something wrong, and our conscience won't let us go back to sleep, even though no one else knows about what we've done. In honor-shame cultures, guilt doesn't kick in, only shame when the deed becomes public. Thus, to be criticized by another leads to shame, and retaliation becomes the only remedy to humiliation. Hostility and violence are considered virtues to be admired. Thus, as we shall see later, honor must be preserved at all costs. And when damaged or lost, honor must be reestablished quickly according to publicly acceptable norms, even if it means killing a child or wife. So let's pause for a moment to see what we have so far. According to Sennels, we have an explosive cocktail when aggressiveness and thin skins are mixed. Even to suggest that Muslims should assimilate can be viewed as unwelcome criticism of their culture, for they conclude that we view their way of life as inferior, that ours is superior and better. The same reaction plays out when we start to question specific Islamic practices or the behaviors of Muhammad, even when true or factual. The result is often overkill, or at least disproportionate to the affront. Let's pause a bit longer and take a general look at this issue of honor-shame by seeing how other cultures see the issue. Codes of honor-shame vary widely between 5 cultural areas. Western culture, based on guilt, which is internalized through our conscience, shame leads to embarrassment when transgressions are publicized. Latin cultures, South America and Southern Europe, link honor-shame to race and economic standing. African culture has a strong community orientation and places high value on ancestry. Next, Asian cultures emphasize respect and politeness To shame others leads to self-shame. In Arab culture or Islamic culture based upon a tribal tradition, group solidarity is vital for public order or cohesion. All must work to avoid any social disruptions. Shame leads to public disorder, and it must be rectified by family members to restore family honor quickly. Shame is public disgrace and humiliation. With this brief cultural overview, let's return to Senel's report in our third cultural factor, victim mentality versus personal responsibility. I hope most of us know that the only person we really can control is ourselves. As hard as some of us may try to control others, we soon learn we can only influence others, not control them. After all, that's one of the major factors why leadership is an art. Thus, taking responsibility for what happens to us is a big step towards maturity. Certainly, things will happen along the journey of life that are beyond our control. But in the end, we have the freedom to choose, hopefully responsibly, and we have the opportunity to improve ourselves. This is a choice that only each of us can make for ourselves. And when tragedies come, we may need a little help to get back on our feet, but in most cases, the ultimate solution remains with ourselves. Senel's found that for Muslim boys in his study, all suffering is caused by others. And it's best if we can find non-Muslim scapegoats. Remember the jihadist sales pitch: Islam is under attack by the West, and Muslims have always been hated by non-Muslims, and they have a right to defend themselves. And if that doesn't work, we can always blame the big scapegoat, Satan. The second part of victim mentality is the scapegoat must change. Islamic Sharia practices must be accepted. Then and only then, good things will happen, like social justice and the removal of temptation. The victimization applies to male-female relations as well. This is what our third webinar was all about: the suppression of female power over men who are just helpless pawns to temptation, seduction, and manipulation by women. Thus, we get this. According to a Muslim cleric who we'll introduce in a moment, women are Satan's weapon against men. And he compares women who don't follow the rules to uncovered meat left in the open. The rape would never happen if the woman stayed behind her veil in her home. So men can take a pass on adultery too, because women have the power of enticement. So our cleric hails from Australia, but because of the social media, he might as well be next door. This is the message that imams are pushing in mosques all over the world. A message of Muslim male victimhood that gives Muslim males every right to rape and sexually assault Western women. In Australia, people are countering the message with creative ads that their wives and daughters are not easy meat, that grooming gangs must be stopped, and in the United Kingdom, more warnings to women. Remember, this is a global problem that is a consequence of the victim mentality revealed in Senel's study. Unfortunately, the rape culture is being promoted as a duty for Muslim men. In this case, on Egyptian television on October 19, 2017, by Nabi Wash, a Muslim attorney. The fourth cultural factor looked at by Senel's and his associates concerned Muslim versus non-Muslims. In general, the West has been willing to accept the differences of others who want to come here to become American. Remember the words of the first motto of the United States, E pluribus unum, out of many one. One nation under God through assimilation and equal justice. Muslim views outsiders or non-believers as infidels, subject to different rules unless they decide to convert to Islam. As we'll see in our webinar on radicalization to jihad, strong feelings of alienation often materialize in second, third generation Muslims. Muslims in their late teens or early 20s searching for an identity filled with rebellious feelings to break free from the teachings of their families. As we've already seen, it's from this group and from recent converts to Islam that has produced all of the independent jihadist attacks in America since 9/11. We've seen previously how Muhammad capitalized on the tribal culture of his time to tell his followers they are a special people superior to all others who are now part of one big tribe, called the Ummah for Muslim community. And this tribe must dominate over all others with no option of coexistence. Three choices are all that are available to non-Muslims. If Islam is superior, our fourth and fifth and final cultural factor explored by Sentinel's report concerns men, women, and children. Just like Islam, Muslim men are superior and are raised to believe they are better human beings, beliefs reinforced by Islamic culture. And there is the cultural norm that female femininity outside the confines of the home must be controlled and hidden, lest social order becomes threatened. As for any woman not following the rules, they become fair game for sexual punishment. The birth of a male child brings family honor, while female births are considered a fountainhead of shame. Recall the words of Noni Darwish and how she was raised to view herself in her Egyptian Muslim home. Muslim men have many acceptable social tools to maintain family order. Our third webinar covered them. And don't forget, a man cannot control his female family members, loses his honor, and no price is too high for him to pay in order to remove the shame he endures. Those who study cultures have uncovered some interesting characteristics on Islamic child rearing techniques that help to explain how male-female role differences are propagated. We've already discussed how the birth of a male child is viewed. A male child is also catered to by his mother through breastfeeding on demand for 2 to 3 years, what certainly helps plant the seed for instant gratification by females to his every need. Not so for the female child. She is not pampered and is weaned much sooner than her male siblings and quickly learns to accept her subordinate role to them. She's also taught that her libido is a ticking time bomb that can only be diffused through painful surgery of female genital mutilation. Another lesson she is taught is that males view females as sex objects, and that it is her obligation not to expose them to temptation. Because males cannot control themselves and resist sexual enticements, it will be her fault if they succumb. And the result will be shame for the family that she must be punished for. When the male child reaches 4, the father assumes more responsibility for his son's socialization. No more pampering. The male's world becomes more authoritarian, and he can expect to be beaten for any infraction of the rules, while the female child remains with her mother to further absorb her subordinate role of being segregated from men, of being confined to the home and always being covered in public. For a more exhaustive look at all the various role differences, as well as many of the other distinguishing characteristics of Arab culture, Rafael Pati's book, The Arab Mind, is a good place to start. For many females in this culture, the mothers are compromised, devalued through abuse as a child, and continue to face struggles in adulthood, always facing corporal punishment for disobedience, or the threat of another wife for her husband, or the threat of being instantly divorced and left homeless. And the children are watching. Sentinel is not only a researcher who has looked at Islamic culture. Violence in the home, where jihadists live in the UK, is at epidemic levels, all tied to the restoration of family honor. sanctioned by Sharia and expected by young girls when they get married, while boys grow up to be violent. Although the cultural differences we've looked at are significant, the consequences of violence within the home, especially for the children, are the same within our culture. Peace officers and social workers are well familiar with the cycle of violence that flows from childhood to adulthood, only to be further transmitted to future generations. This cycle is not unique to Islamic culture. There are places in America where there are high concentrations of Muslim refugees who live in virtual segregated communities. One is the large Somali population in the Minneapolis area. Remember, Muslims are told by their religious leaders not to assimilate, but to live by Sharia. In the book on the right, Dr. Coburn dares to discuss and write about the barbarism that is normalized within Arab and Muslim families. She speaks about unthinkable daily realities inflicted on Muslim children and women, all hidden and denied. Coburn goes on to suggest that Islamic suicide, terrorism, or cold-blooded murder may be psychologically attributed to the displaced rage against one's childhood mother, a woman who we've seen has been overly controlled, devalued, and battered. Before we explored in greater detail what Coburn has discovered, let's take a quick look at the differences between integration and assimilation. After all, the Muslim Brotherhood only speaks to integration in its explanatory memo, not assimilation. In December 2017, Hudna Ibrahim toured Minnesota and presented a clear distinction between integrate and assimilate. Integrate means living with others, but not adopting their culture. Assimilate, on the other hand, is to abandon one's home culture, which is considered under Islam a crime against humanity. So there's going to be no attempt to change from or discard the many cultural factors we've been looking at that lead Muslim boys to be violent. Returning to Coburn, she says the obvious that violence is learned in the home at a very young age. And because of her focus on Islamic terrorism by suicide, Coburn says such violence can be buried just like an IED, waiting to be activated later through the radicalization process and influence. The FBI has estimated 60% of jihadists have an encounter with domestic violence prior to engaging in terrorism. So the cultural factors we've been discussing, aggressiveness and anger, having to take no responsibility to control their sexual impulses, and by being pampered by their mothers, all contribute to rage easily triggered in Muslim males. For females, her fate is much different and harmful, and she grows up knowing that she is under the threat of death through honor killing that her parents cannot be held legally responsible under Sharia law. She also knows she is not equal to men, but are considered their property, and can be beaten by her husband in a marriage that has been predetermined without her consent, maybe to her first cousin. That her self-identity must be concealed in public, and that her sexuality has been permanently removed by the older women in her family. This is why peace officers, social workers, and judicial officials must come out from behind the blinds of political correctness and understand the cultural differences that lead to sexual abuse and violence in Muslims' families, especially those that do not assimilate. As we've covered previously, Muslim men fear women and their powers of enticement and go to great lengths to keep them segregated. As a consequence of no heterosexual contacts outside of the home, there is a prevalence of male homosexuality in Muslim culture. Coburn discusses how both Arab and Muslim boys and girls are often orally and anally raped by older male relatives, and boys between the ages of 7 and 12 are publicly and dramatically circumcised. According to Phyllis Chesler in her 1978 book About Men, quote, cruelty towards sons may be a cruel component in the mother and women-hating culture, where women are scapegoated for the crimes of men, end quote. Chesler continues, the absolute degradation of Arab and Muslim women by a shame-honor society means that sons must perpetually rid themselves of the contamination that contact with women represents, and that sons must psychologically abandon their mothers. The consequences of many young boys is also facing sexual violence at the hands of older adult males, as previously publicized by PBS and the Dancing Boys in Afghanistan. All of what we've been discussing is Sharia-sanctioned pedophilia. This is why peace officers and social workers must be vigilant when dealing with Muslim families. Because this man-boy sexual conduct is not done out of any affection or love, it is not considered homosexual behavior, which is a violation of Sharia. A violation if a man leaves his wife for another man. Pederasty is a common crime, again sanctioned by Sharia, sometimes referred to as boy play. Something else to be alert for, child porn. British police have found massive amounts on jihadi computers and first uncovered the problem in 2006 all across Europe during investigations into jihadist advanced plots. There are even some law enforcement officials that say jihadists embed communications between groups within child porn. Imagine, if you will, being the law enforcement officer who's given the duty assignment to look for such communications. European women, and some in America, are paying the price for all this. In Norway, 90% of rapes of non-Muslim women are committed by Muslim men. All stranger-on-stranger rapes of non-Muslim women were committed by Muslim men, with 80% of the victims indigenous to Norway. All this when Muslims represented only 1.5% of the population. I believe that most European law enforcement authorities have now stopped keeping separate statistics on Muslim rapes and other sex offenses. A similar situation in Sweden, but only worse. 77.6% of ambush rapes committed by Muslim males, a 500% increase since 2003. Over 1 in 4 Swedish women will be raped, and child rape of less than 15-year-old has doubled, with a Muslim population of only 5%. All attributed to the increase in Muslim migrants, unfortunately with little public pushback. And since 2001, rape against Swedish women, as I said, has skyrocketed. Since 2015, UK authorities have known the painful truth about child rape and molestations committed by Muslims. In fact, Muslim men are 200 times more prone to rape children than non-Muslim men. The same for Holland. We'll cover the specific problem of Muslim grooming gangs in webinar number 10. Closer to home, a 2014 conviction for sex trafficking, and 5 Muslims in Colorado gang rape a 53-year-old woman, and 4 more in Rhode Island attack a college students at Johnson and Wales University. Another cultural factor leading to violence is inbreeding. Remember the fate facing many young Muslim girls who are forced to marry their first cousins. The consequences of inbreeding are well documented by the experts, both mental and physical. Some of the results. We can summarize that the cultural factors leading to Muslim violence, uncovered in Sendel's report, are considered admirable, sanctioned by Sharia, and propagated within segregated Muslim enclaves. To criticize any of this will be labeled Islamophobic, racist, and hateful attacks on Islamic honor that must be silenced. Attacks that further contribute to the false narrative of Muslim victimhood, as previously discussed in the sales pitch used by fundamentalists. Because Islam is considered superior, there can be no exposure to other cultures. And finally, because so many in responsible positions are ignorant or do not want to face the hard facts, many women and children are being sacrificed for political correctness. Just like we saw the differences between our Western mindset about peace from how fundamentalists view peace, we can also see a different mindset about violence. Currently in the West, we see violence as attributable to mental illness or to various forms of psychological dysfunction. We also have seen some blame violence on various social circumstances of the perpetrator, like poverty, drugs, discrimination, racism, guns, global warming, climate change, you name it, the progressives are throwing it at us. The progressives are also telling us that cultures are not to blame and that there is no nexus between terrorism and Islam. So we must look elsewhere to various social movement theories. The fundamentalists believe, however, that violence is normal, part of family life, and certainly part of husband-wife relations. And violence in all its forms is justified by Sharia except for any used by non-Muslims against Muslims. And finally, the fundamentalists promote its use to achieve peace and social justice over mankind while sanctioning it to maintain or reestablishing family honor. With this jihadist fundamentalist mindset about violence in mind, let's now look at a much darker side of it. A side of violence that jihadists hold and that was explained in a document called The Management of Savagery, the most critical stage through which the Ummah will pass. Pay attention to the document's subtitle, The Most Critical Stage the Ummah or Muslim Community will pass. Another example of what our enemy writes to his followers and how it helps to fulfill Sun Tzu's maxim, we must know our enemy if we want to defeat him. The document was called The Mein Kampf of Jihad by the Washington Post. It was published in 2004 and translated into English in 2006 at the Combating Terrorism Center at West Point. So our nation's military leaders have had possession of this document for well over a decade. But because of the purge of Islamic threat training, it probably has not received anywhere near the attention it deserves. The document was prepared by Abu Bakr Naji, who we first met in webinar number 2 when we covered the current threat. Naji was a senior al-Qaeda official who some believe is the group's chief theoretician. And not just al-Qaeda, but ISIS and other jihadists pay close attention to what he writes. Remember, Naji made this statement that underscored the new strategy jihadists adopted back in 2005 to launch smaller, cheaper, more frequent attacks against the West, executed by what? Independent operatives through a concept referred to as leaderless resistance. Shocking violence equates to violence 5.0 on a scale of 1 to 5. It is a level of barbarity that shocks the conscience of normal people and has been incorporated into ISIS's strategy to break their enemies' will and to recruit new followers. Again, the ultimate goal is to establish a worldwide Islamic state over mankind. And the Geneva Convention rules do not apply to how prisoners or hostages should be handled. The few remaining Christians in the Middle East have been subjected to this type of violence for years, with few of our religious leaders saying a word about it. We tend to view this as a problem over there, in Syria, Iraq, and Northern Africa. But let's not for a moment forget the information we have about sleeper cells already here, consisting of jihadists trained by ISIS and Al-Qaeda operatives, not to mention the ISIS training camps located near the Tex-Mex border. Please note the religious aspect of jihad and how it's considered a blessed act of worship. By way of reminder, we've been told that these barbaric acts have nothing to do with Islam. But then our jihadist enemies tells us otherwise. I will instill terror into the hearts of the unbelievers, smite ye above their necks, and smite all their fingertips off. Chapter 8, verse 12 of the Quran. Therefore, when ye meet the unbelievers in fight, strike off their heads. Chapter 47, verse 4. And as we learned in Webinar 4, when Muhammad took part in the Battle of the Trench in 627, he ordered the beheadings of over 600 Jewish warriors who had surrendered to him. Then there are the burnings of captives. Indeed, those who disbelieve in our verses, we will drive them in a fire. Every time their skins are roasted through, we will replace them with our other skins, so they may taste the punishment. Chapter 4, verse 56. In this case, a Muslim Jordanian pilot killed on February 3, 2015. So returning to Senel's report of Muslim violence and what causes this, we see there are a variety of cultural practices and beliefs that contribute to the high rate of violence committed against Muslims and non-Muslims alike. And we've seen examples of the use of savagery and barbaric violence used by jihadists as acts of religious expression, while Muhammad provides the perfect example for jihadists to follow. We now turn to several domestic issues related to fundamentalist Islam. For peace officers, social circle workers, and judicial officials that sooner or later they'll find in their inbox. So what we'll cover are all of these topics, but only the first tonight. Several of these topics we've addressed previously, but as we'll soon see, there is much more to learn about each. So let's start with honor killings. By way of review, when a Muslim family is shamed, it's the male's responsibility to restore honor. And it must be done quickly and can even involve the murder of a family member. As said in the Green Book, the following are not subject to retaliation: a father or mother for killing their offspring or offspring's offspring. Family honor, cohesion, and honorable public reputation dominate. Men must be viewed by others as being in control of their family members. Any shameful behavior publicizes to the community that male control is lost, and a failure to respond by the senior male member will bring added shame. If the shameful act involves a female family member, there is nothing she can do to reestablish family's honor. Even gossip about a female's behavior, demeanor, or dress can bring shame, and truth is no defense. Thus, it is the responsibility of the male family members to reestablish the female's honor, even through murder when necessary. But as we'll see, the male family member often are aided by other females in the family, which for law enforcement and judicial officials means there are multiple perpetrators to consider. A valuable source about honor killings and violence is this book, co-authored by Daniel Akbari and Paul Totorow. Gera violence. The book addresses this term as physical punishment used by male family members toward a female because of something the female does involving her sexuality that causes shame. As we've heard from Dr. Nancy Coburn before, she underscores the obsession Muslim family members have for their daughter's virginity, sexual purity, and any other behaviors considered shameful. This fury and anger are at such high levels that the shamed father or husband will not rest until the daughter or wife is killed, and the shame has been washed away by blood, and thereby his honor and the honor of his family have been restored. As we shall see, it may take months or years to track down the offending female. Whatever it takes, no cost is too high. This is why Dr. Phyllis Chesler warns that a Muslim woman who is attempting to flee from her husband or father and other family members must be put into the government's witness protection program for her protection. Men can take action to preserve or enhance their honor, one being by controlling female family members. Females, on the other hand, can do nothing to increase their honor. They are born with sexual purity. If they lose it before marriage, they can never regain their honor, and their shame applies to the whole family, and it totally abrogates male honor until honor is reestablished by the killing of the daughter. Only in the case of the virgins in paradise is virginity recyclable. Yes, there are indeed other cultures that promote and condone honor violence. It is practiced by Hindus and Sikhs, but the big difference is that when they do so, they do it in their country of origin. They do not bring this custom with them to the West. The other big difference is that the overwhelming numbers of honor killings worldwide are committed by Muslim men against women. In North America, the figures are 84%, with 49% of the female victims killed by a family member in North America, and 52% murdered by their fathers, with multiple murders the highest in North America, with many victims tortured. We'll look at some recent examples a little bit later. But first, what are the reasons why Muslim male family members experience such levels of fury and anger and to kill? For 91% of the identified honor killings in North America, it's because of the offending female has become too westernized. Only 9% of the murders involve sexual impropriety. So we must ask why. Why does becoming westernized trigger Gera violence in Muslim males? Recall the significance of many jihadist attacks that have triggered Western women for not following the rules, like the Ariana Grande concert in Manchester, England. The same rationale applies to Muslim females. The taking of non-Muslims as friends, and by implication accepting and even practicing a sexualized Western lifestyle, or becoming willing to give up Islamic cultural norms, thereby become disloyal to the big tribe, all signal that male control over the family has been lost in favor of female rights to do as they please. This ends our webinar for this evening. Before I turn the proceedings over to Mary, the major topics for webinar number 9 are as follows.
Thank you, everyone, for coming tonight. And we have a few announcements before we get into the Q&A. So wanted to just talk to a little bit the last slide that David presented. He left it for you to read, but I think it's good for us just to kind of go over it. The webinar for next week, which is titled Honor Violence and Emerging Issues Part 1, is going to be covering the 2 categories and profiles of honor violence victims. How honor violence differs from domestic violence, and that I think is really key. This is where the law enforcement and judges and judicial officials and even social workers, they need to understand the real difference. So that's really key. I'm excited to hear that for next week. Another look at forced marriages of Muslim females, the use of FGM to control Muslim female sexuality, and law enforcement response considerations to honor violence, forced marriages, and FGM. So that's what's going to be covered next week, and that is webinar number 9, which means we've gotten halfway through all of our webinars. And what we need to tell you tonight is that David is not with us tonight to do the Q&A. I see that there's 2 in the hopper for us right now. What we're going to do is take these Q&As, the questions, and thank you, Dan, for submitting them, and hold them over for David, because I think it's key that he answers the questions based on his material and knowledge and the experience he's got doing this training. So we're going to hold off on doing the questions until next week when David is with us, and we are rather excited to tell you why he's not with us. This, of course, is his material. He does it. He's been doing it for over 5 years and upwards of 1,500 plus law enforcement officers that he's been doing this training for. The training that you're getting here in this 16 weeks is what he normally does in a 2-day program in front of officers, and that is where he's at today. That's where he's going to be doing his training in front of officers. So we're excited to allow him to be able to do that. We're glad we can do this pre-recording to get the material done and get it out to you. And the detail is so great, and we of course did the pre-recording, started those so that we had less technical difficulties while we were doing this. But it's pretty incredible to think about where he's at and what he's doing in terms of the leadership that brought him in, the leadership that took a stand and knew there might be challenges to this training, but is doing it. They had the courageous ability to recognize that their officers needed this training, and we feel it's critical, and David does as well. And so this is encouraging that he's actually out doing face-to-face training now. So thank you to the courageous officers doing this, taking the class. Think about the ones that had to sign up for it as well in the classroom. Now, since we're halfway through the 16 weeks, we are actually starting to plan our next phase in all of this training that we want to offer. So we are very open to you emailing us at the spearpoint911 at shariacrimestoppers.org, and hope that you would be willing to give us some thoughts and ideas on that. And the last thing I want to mention too is that we realized when we scheduled these that we're doing them on a Tuesday. We thought we were free from any kind of interruptions or holidays or anything as well. And so what we realized was that we have one scheduled, and I'm looking at a calendar if you're wondering why I'm looking to the right. We have one scheduled on November 6th, which is, of course, Election Day. And we are feeling that that probably is going to be a night that everybody's going to be watching their TVs and voting, and so that we're going to cancel that night and just continue the following week with our subject matter. So November 6th, we won't be holding a webinar as we originally planned, and we're sorry if that is upsetting to anybody, but we think it's probably smarter that we will have a bigger audience being able to join us the following week. So let me go to our next slide. And just remind everybody, of course, oops, sorry, that's our Q&A slide. And what I wanted to go to was this one, the Global Patriot Radio Network. We just remind everybody that we have a new radio program. It's on Friday nights, 7 p.m. Eastern. We're hoping that some of you are joining us and spreading the word for us, helping us to get the information out there. And of course, it's Sharia Crime Stoppers Action Line. Find us at blogtalkradio.com/Global Patriot Radio. You can call us to just listen at 319-527-6706. But please, 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 please remember, press 1 if you want to join the conversation, ask a question, tell us what's going on in your neighborhood. So we're anxious to hear from you along with the guests that we're bringing on. But if you can't make it on Friday nights, like we're doing with our webinars, they're always recorded. And in terms of the location for the Friday night radio show, the on demand is where you're going to find them at Blog Talk Radio/Global Patriot Radio. And I'm going to bring Dick back on now to tell us about what this Friday's program is going to be about, and he will close out the evening. Thanks again, everybody, for joining us tonight. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Mary. Yeah, just briefly, tomorrow you will see the complete detail about the Friday night radio program. And the radio program, we're happy to announce, by the way, if you go on United West, and if you actually go to Global Talk Radio, you could look at last Friday's webinar, which was John Guandolo and Steve Amundsen. That's completely recorded. It was almost a 2-hour show. You're welcome to listen to our guests as well as the people that did call in. This Friday night, we're enthused to talk about a really, really important topic. And before the election, the topic is the interfaith dialogue deception, and our guest is Philip Haney. You probably know that Philip Haney is the DHS whistleblower that has been around the country diligently trying to make people wake up during the election season. He's going to specifically talk about the deception that is part of the interfaith dialogue. He will talk about the fact it's really more like a interfaith dialogue, and that there are collaborators that we need to call out in the Christian and Jewish community who are collaborating with Islam on a one-way bridge. It's quite dangerous for people of the book. He'll talk about that. He'll talk about why Christian and Jewish collaborators don't ask a few basic questions about Islam's perspective on Christianity before they engage in dialogue. So a very, very timely topic. These interfaith activities are having an impact on the election in places like Michigan and Minnesota and other places. And again, we're going to encourage you to call in, listen, and also raise push number 1 so you can participate in the conversation. Again, next week, so that's Friday, that would be the 26th, and then Tuesday next week, we are meeting. Tuesday next week would be the 30th, and that topic then, we've discussed the topic there moving forward, as Mary explained. I do want to take a special note to remind you that there is a very, very comprehensive set of written summaries of each and every webinar. And for that reason, we need to thank Christopher Wright of the Sharia Tip Sheet, which is located at liberato.us. He is diligently watching and diligently and promptly summarizing each and every bullet point, and it's a way for you to remind yourself of what you've heard. It's also a way for you to share the content with another person, let them get interested in the bullet points that he's describing, and maybe have them listen to the podcast and join us. So we want to thank you for being with us tonight. Next week, David will be here live, and we'll have a full Q&A session. And we want to thank you again and say good night.